Welcome, everybody. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. Every week, we bring you stories from around the world about how people are bringing insights and innovation to making communities locally and globally better in some fashion. We are Rotarians, members of Rotary International. There are 1.2 million members around the world and 36,000 clubs. And our club's one of them, the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley, an online and asynchronous Rotary club. Our interests really focus in on issues of education, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And we have with us a speaker today from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Specifically, he is the director of the Center for Aging Science, and he is an associate dean for research. And he's going to be talking to us about problems, and I air quote that, problems with population, because for many people there is a missing sense of the possibility that may have to do with changing population trends. And we're going to get a lot of that tonight. You read some of the introduction on the way into seeing this. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to our speaker. Stuart, it is so good to have you with us. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Rustin, and thank you so much for the invitation. And it's a real pleasure to be with you tonight and to be able to talk to Rotarians in this amazing organization all around the world here from Hong Kong. So that's right, I'm going to be talking about population and kind of channeling Homer Simpson in the sense of talking, and he thought something else was the cause and the solution to all of life's problems. Well, actually, I'm going to suggest that Rotary is in some ways responsible for many of the demographic problems we have in the world. Don't panic. It's not. This is in a good way, but then also that Rotary can play a significant role in shaping our demographic future. So it's always nice to be invited to give any kind of presentation, not least because demographers, we're not really allowed out very much because we kind of get a little bit depressing, and because people think that population is a bit depressing. And not only is it a bit depressing, it's also a little bit kind of paradoxical, because if you think about population today, it seems as though we've got too many people in the world. Oh, there's too many people in the world. But then other people say, oh no, but there's not enough people in the world. Okay, so maybe there's too many people here and not enough people there. And then you've got other people who say, oh, we've got too many older people, right? We've got this aging crisis all around the world. But then at the same time, in other parts of the world, people say, well, we've got too many younger people, right? That we have this almost kind of impossible demographic system around the world, which of course would be made much easier if people just moved from one part of the world to the other. But a lot of people don't like that, and politicians in particular don't like to talk about that. So this is how population is often seen as the problem. If we have overpopulation, this is this narrative, this story about resource scarcity, the environmental footprint, that it holds back development, that we have a youth bulge in some places, so there's too many young people. This is a threat to security and governance. On the other hand, we have this underpopulated world, this aging world. Here we have a drain on productivity, social welfare systems are going to go bust, healthcare systems are going to collapse under the weight of this older population. There'll be feedback loops, so low fertility begets even lower fertility. Even from this geopolitical standpoint, there is a sense of a kind of national decrepitude almost. And of course, this is nothing new. This narrative has been going back for hundreds of years about putting population at the heart of any concern. More recently, or certainly in the 20th century, this book may be familiar to some of you, Paul Ehrlich's concern about the population bomb. While you are reading these words, 5 people, mostly children, have died of starvation, and 40 more babies have been born. Anyway, this has kind of been updated in more recent. Still love this time bomb or this ticking bomb metaphor. This is a recent video foretelling the impending collapse of human civilization because of the decline in human fertility. We have China as a demographic time bomb. But by the OECD no less, so a concern about the future of China. And then this is updated in various different ways. China's aging population is a major threat to its future. And then in not even great big countries like China, everywhere is little Guernsey, little tiny Guernsey, wonderful, beautiful place, one of the Channel Islands. And even in there, even in Guernsey, the social care fund will run out without action. It is a demographic time bomb. So everywhere from little tiny Guernsey to huge China, this major concern. And even we get to the stage of the so-called silver tsunami, or this grey tsunami, that healthcare systems, pension systems, countries are going to be completely overwhelmed by this. And of course, this is extraordinarily offensive. It's extraordinarily ageist. It's extraordinarily offensive to older people, just that they're kind of overwhelming the system. It's also very offensive to anybody who's suffered through a tsunami as well. But it just goes to show you how we've kind of almost taken leave of our senses. We're going to accept any kind of metaphor just to show how bad things are. So the first thing I want to do, of course, is before all this doom and gloom, think about how all this came about. Well, one of the main reasons why we've got a bigger population in the world is because people are dying less. And that tends to be thought of as a pretty good thing. This has come about through medicine and vaccination and public health and broader well-being and sanitation and housing. This is not a terrible thing, right? That people are living for longer. Also, people are having fewer children. And we have to think about, well, where does that come from? Well, it's about these changes in education, in urbanization, in economic opportunities, and female empowerment. And again, also linked back to people dying less. That is another fundamental driver in shaping families in the 21st century. And of course, it's a positive thing because people, and women in particular, have more choices. More choices in terms of work, in terms of family and family planning, household formation, to derive the kind of life that people want to do. Not equally all around the world by any means, and there's still a very, very long way to go. But that change is a positive one. And of course, Rotary has played a role in this. Rotary has played a role in many of these kind of different revolutions, particularly in terms of skills and education, and of course in health and vaccination and so on, right? So Rotary is part of that process of, I would say, making the world a better place, but of course with these implications for population change. But still, we still think about these demographic problems around the world, of too many people, too few people, aging, population stagnation, and so on. And the natural thing, of course, is to look for demographic solutions. If we're worried about aging, and aging is caused by low fertility, let's just increase fertility. Let's have people having more babies, right? And of course, we have these very simplistic policies to encourage or support people to have more babies. In South Korea, one of the lowest fertility rates in the world, South Korean government workers a few years ago, at 7 o'clock, they'll switch off the lights on a Wednesday so everybody can go home and make babies. Of course, it's obviously just as simple as that. That's all you need to do is just switch off the lights, and then 9 months later, pop, all of these babies pop out. Or you have policies like in Singapore, baby bonuses, incentivizing people to get married and have children. Or you have this kind of mean-spirited, nasty stuff. I would say nasty. This is from the Korean Productivity Council. Well, you don't really need me to talk through the metaphor. On the left-hand side, look at this very sad, depressed, miserable wheat leaf. But on the right-hand side, with 2 leaves, of course, for 2 children. Now this is a happy, vibrant, growing plant. Okay, but of course, these are not really working very well. And part of the reason is because we are very poor at defining the problems, right? What is the problem of aging? What is the problem of growth or decline or whatever it is? And in fact, when we look at this picture here, which I brushed over before, China's aging population is a major threat to its future. Well, actually, it doesn't look so bad, does it? These are, 80-something-year-old men and women in Hainan, which they call China's Florida. Whether you agree with that is your, but they're having a great life. They're fit and healthy and spending a lot of money. Doesn't look that bad, does it? then we also realized just having more babies is a pretty inefficient solution. I can't believe I still have to point this out, but babies don't work. This picture in the corner here is not a genuine baby doing business, right? They've just put him in an outfit, right? Babies do not work. And so any kind of demographic solution relying on high fertility is going to take a very long time to develop. And so we have this problem of a closed loop mentality, that we've got these demographic problems, we have to fix them demographically. And of course, China, I mean, I predominantly work on China, so I hope you don't mind, I'll talk a little bit more about China. And you know, we see in recent years the major concern over low fertility in China, and this demographic crisis, which is going to overwhelm the system. And of course, what is the first thing, the first tool that we reach for? Boom, yes, let's fix it by just having more babies. Let's have baby bonus and give greater opportunities, encouraging people to have more children. But what I want to try to argue is that this two-dimensional way of looking at the world and the population in the world, I think is very, very misleading. And not only is it misleading in terms of how we define the problem, but also how we can look for the solutions. The number of people age 65, for example, is irrelevant. It doesn't, in and of itself, it doesn't make any difference, because it's not like when you're 64 and 364 days, you're perfectly fit and healthy and walking along, and then on your 65th birthday at the stroke of midnight, like everything just packs in, right? Your back gives up, right? You can't walk. It's crazy to think like that. So the only reason why we care about the number of 65-year-olds is if something else happens, like you get a pension or you have to retire or something like that. And also we have to remember that people are changing over time. So a 65-year-old today is going to be completely different to a 65-year-old 50 years ago, and a 65-year-old in the future. So we have to take that into consideration as well. So I just want to illustrate this point, just to show you some recent research my colleagues and I have done for China. So here we think about a classic measure of demographic measure, what we call dependency, right? So this is simply the number of people aged 15 to 64 divided by the population below age 15 and above age 65, right? And so this can then tell us like this relationship between what we think of as the working age population and everybody else. And so this is the standard kind of narrative for China. And the TFR means the total fertility rate. So whether or not the fertility rate is very low or relatively high, it doesn't matter. We're still going to see this silver tsunami, so to say, into the future. The number of people, of older people compared to the rest of the population and younger people is going to increase. But of course, not everybody aged 15 to 64 works. And also not everybody who's above 65 does not work, right? So we have to actually consider the real world in terms of those institutions. And we think about the labor force. So instead of just taking age as our only proxy for dependency, so-called, we can think about the labor force. And when we do that, actually, it doesn't look so bad, right? The labor force, so-called labor force dependency ratio, is lower than the older age dependency ratio. But then we have this other dimension as well, because China in the future, yes, will have a smaller population. It's still going to be very big. It's still going to be 1.3 billion. So don't panic, right? It's still going to be big, but it's also, and it's going to be older. But if we add another dimension, we will see that it's also going to be much more highly educated, much more highly skilled. And so the question is, can those skills and that higher education level be translated into better health, better skills, and of course, better productivity? And of course, I think we can assume that it could do that. There is a possibility that it could do that. So we can create a further dependency ratio, which is what it's not a very sexy title, I have to say, but this is the productivity weighted labor force dependency ratio. Wow, sorry, it's a little bit late on a Sunday night to talk about that, but we can see that if we assume that a better educated population could be more productive and could be healthier, then actually the future is completely different. Is that the possibilities for that population are going to be completely and utterly different, and the challenges are not going to be anywhere near as drastic or dramatic as if we only look at the population. So we have to consider these different dimensions as well. So the last thing I just want to add, I want to come back to where Rotary can fit into this, because at the minute we tend to think of, as we think of demographers, and people like me have this monopoly on the future, right? We tell you, oh, well, this is what the population of China is going to look like in the future. So then you've got to kind of deal with it and find a solution to that. And of course, that's not true. All we're doing is presenting one possible view of the future based upon whatever kind of assumptions that we want to make. Whereas actually, this is not what the future has to be. The future can be very, very different. So let's just take a quick look, finish up with Senegal. It could be any country on earth, but just for the sake of it, I'm going to choose Senegal here. I like the flag, right? And so when we look at Senegal today, we can see that it's a population of about 15 million, very much characterized by lower levels of education, very few people getting beyond secondary, and not even that many people going into secondary education. So our typical perspective would to say, well, this is what the future will look like, right? In 2050, it'll be a much bigger population overall and an expansion in secondary education. But this is not what the future has to be. The future can look very different, because if we don't invest significant amount of money in education and skills and health and well-being, then fertility will be higher, the population size will be higher, and we won't get those kind of demographic dividends. We will still be characterized by very high rates of low education, if you will. But on the other hand, if we really invest in education and skills and health, we can have a very, very different population future. Yes, it'll be older and it'll be smaller, but I think you would agree that a population that looks like this in my top right-hand corner has a lot more potential for sustainable, inclusive growth and basically a better future for the entire population. And that's where, of course, Rotary, I think, can come into this, right? It's not about us telling you what the future will look like, and then you've got to deal with it. Rotary and all organizations around the world, governments and individuals, we can actually choose the future that we want, rather than being frightened of the future that demographers often present. Anyway, thank you very much.
Fantastic, Stuart. Thank you very much. So first of all, let me do some quick introductions, and then we'll jump into the Q&A. We have with us another one of our members, our Paella Master, Shag Shagrin, in Walnut Creek, California.
Oh, sorry, wrong background.
Thank you, Shag.
You're welcome.
Excellent. My name is Rushton Hurley. I am the programs chair for the club, and I'll start us off with the questions. Stuart, one of the things that excites me about the nature of your work is that one way I see innovation is people looking at something that most people would consider a problem and essentially seeing an opportunity. Mm-hmm. And I feel like a lot of what I have read that's most interesting about population changes come from those places where there have been quite creative ways of dealing with, say, declining population. Can you speak to some of the examples of that in China and elsewhere?
Well, Rushton, before you go there, isn't the word in Chinese for problem the same as opportunity? Or something like a challenge and opportunity.
So
it's the same.
Yes, and Stuart, as you look at that, is there something specific that you'd kind of point to as the nature of where an organization of Rotarians can stop and say, all right, well, maybe we can be part of those kinds of innovations, those kinds of opportunities?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that, when you think about, if you're thinking about the future, I think that the education and skill development and, broadening this out to kind of vocational, because, you don't want to have everybody with a PhD, right? Nothing will get done, right? So it needs to be not just about more education, but better education as well, right? And so that will mean making sure that curriculums and schools are not only improving in quality, but they are aligned with the kind of the needs of the labour market, or at least with the with what may be the kind of the future direction of the labour market. And so that's kind of vocational training and things like that. And then also that will be lifelong learning as well, and having the flexibility to change, because of course the days for many people of having a job at age 18 or 21 and being in that job for the rest of your life till you're 65, those days are numbered, if not gone. And for many parts of the world, they never even started in the first place, right? So there'll need to be this kind of flexibility and changing over time. So I think that's one way where I think that Rotarians, with that kind of passion for skills in education, can actually really make a major influence there. I think the second thing, I mean, you asked me about where programs have brought in, have been able to deal with these kind of challenges and seen it as an opportunity. I mean, with depopulation, to a certain degree, depopulation is relatively new, right, at the national level. Okay, it's not something, natural depopulation, as opposed to as a consequence of war or famine or things like this, is relatively new. Managed depopulation, but what we would see, so that, again, we have to think about, well, what is the problem of depopulation, right? If it's about the provision of public services in a sparsely populated rural area, then we have to deal with that in that particular way. And various different governments around the world have been very effective at trying to reform public services to manage that in a particular way. If we're worried about culture and kind of intangible culture or language dying out in particular areas, then of course we've got to think about ways to do that. And governments have been very effective, I think, in some places, of building up a kind of rural development and rural tourism and kind of cultural change in that. But I think one of the things in terms of the most successful programs we could look at around the world have been ones where you've actually seen that younger people and older people, they're not against each other, right? It's not, the problem is not of aging or of too many younger people, whatever. It's about kind of trying to build intergenerational linkages, right? So that's why we put, programs which put playgrounds and children's, daycare centres and older people's homes next to each other. So there is an engagement there. Programs where we can bridge the digital divide in terms of younger people who can work with and help older people to use smartphones and to be able to use the internet and to better use the internet and better use digital devices. So then that has that's that kind of added value, right? Because yes, it improves the skills of older people. We can bridge the digital divide, but then also it can create these intergenerational linkages, which I think is one of the biggest threats around at the moment, which is this kind of break or this cleavage in the intergenerational contract. Certainly the case in Britain and in many places in the world, here in Hong Kong as well.
So when you think of what happens in Hong Kong and in China, China's demographics have been a particularly compelling example of what happens with policies and with how things might alter. And I think about the movement of so many people from rural spaces into the cities. Is that something where the Chinese government has been more successful than in attempts merely to encourage people to have more children?
Well, yeah, I think, again, with China, it's precisely that point of saying, well, look, you have to look in a multidimensional way, right? That over the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, yes, fertility fell very rapidly, and this was the time of family planning restrictions. But also at the same time, there was tremendous urbanization, and as you say, and tremendous economic growth, higher levels of female labour force participation, and so on. So the one-child policy, or the later long and fewer policy of the 70s, was not the only thing that was going on. And so therefore, that's why when you think about today, any policy that will only increase the number of children in a particular province, whether or not it's going to work or not is will be conditioned on those other factors as well, right? It will be conditioned upon the opportunity of having children, the opportunity cost, the real cost, the indirect cost, the cost of people's career of having children. But even if these policies are successful, so you think about somewhere like in the northeast, you go up to Liaoning province, Heilongjiang province, Jilin province. So these have got some of the lowest fertility rates in China. So let's say the government is very, very successful and manages to increase the fertility rate up, and we get a few more tens of thousands of babies being born. But then as soon as they turn 18 or 21, they'll just leave because there'll be no economic opportunities. There is a reason why people leave the northeast of China, is because the economic opportunities there are are lower than in other parts of the country. So you have to look at it in that integrated way, right? That you're not actually going to be solving anything in the northeast if you have more children, and then as soon as they are able to, they will just leave and move to another part of the country. So again, I think China is that perfect example of this, having to think in this multidimensional, interconnected, holistic way.
Well, it makes me think that one of the things that we deal with is the difference between an appreciation of complexity and an addiction to simplicity, right? So, you brought up a number of different titles for articles and posts, that talk about the demographic time bomb. And I wonder if there's like some journalistic code that if you're going to write about demographics, you have to include that phrase, in the same way that in the American media, whenever they write about education, they talk about this is not the silver bullet, like we're waiting for one thing to fix everything, right? So is it the case that this is one of those fields where the fairly obvious complexities, and I think, understanding the kinds of differences between where people are, given the mobility that we have, that you just described, between, a rural area and an urban area, is something that also hampers policy decisions about what to do about changes in demographics in different places. Is that something that your research bears out?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. I think it's absolutely right that, and this really goes back to, I would say back to Malthus, right? One of the first big demographic writers at the end of the 18th century, Thomas Robert Malthus, who, made very simply said, well, population will grow arithmetically. Population will grow exponentially, but food production will only grow arithmetically. And the point at which they cross over, then you've got a big problem, right? But he, he was saying, and as many people do today, and that's why this ticking time bomb metaphor, I think, is so powerful, is to say, well, look, it's a very slow burning process. The German pension system was brought in at the end of the 19th century, and only really today is a real panic kind of setting in about how we're going to manage this, right? It'd be the same with pension systems all around the world, because it's just been kind of left for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, on and on and on and on and on, and then it becomes somebody's problem in the future. And that's, again, the problem with a 4 or 5 year democratic cycle, right? Is that you can actually leave these problems into the future. And also another term we use that is used as well is demography is destiny, right? And again, it's that view of, well, the future is almost kind of fixed, right? That this is what it is, and that we can't do anything about it. So I think that it really does hamper our ability to design better policy. And I think the last thing just to say is that I think a big problem is that too often journalists or policymakers or other stakeholders, we think of population as a kind of as just an amorphous group, right? It's somehow separate to ourselves. And that it's this, and it actually, to go back to a Chinese expression, so Chinese for population is runkou, right? Which actually means person mouths, right? Or people mouths. So in that sense, you can really imagine, when you think of the population, there's people's mouths, right? Who eat and talk and chat and move around, right? So it's much more, you can actually see it for what it is. Whereas the danger in most cases is what we call, or what I sometimes call, spreadsheet demography, which is that you can fix all of your problems just by moving numbers around on a spreadsheet. But moving numbers around on a spreadsheet is fine if you're talking about like selling, you know, units or pens or making glasses or whatever. But if moving these numbers around on a spreadsheet involves people having more children, or people moving from one part of the world to another, or people living for longer, that's very complicated, right? And particularly in this kind of postmodern world. Don't panic. I'm not going to go all sociologic-y and go talking about postmodernism. Don't, you know, or critical race theory and everything's good. No, don't worry. I'll just talk about, but just in a postmodern world, not everybody wants the same thing. People have very different ideas and attitudes about what they want their own life to look like. And so that's where these policies which say to people, you know, we expect you to do this, or why don't you do that? They're not going to work, because everyone's aspirations and hopes and dreams and plans for success are going to be will always be completely different. And we have to kind of factor that post-modernity, I think, into our, just to make things even more complicated, into our thinking about the future of demographic change.
Wonderful. All right, fantastic. Well, we have reached that time. And so in a moment, I'll pass it back to you with the final word. But for all of you who have been watching this recording on our site at siliconvalleyrotary.com, or if you know the shortcut, rotary.cool, yes, that does actually lead to our site, then you will know that there are a few more things that we'd like you to do. One is to let us know you were here. There is an attendance form just a little bit down the page. We always like to be able to say, hey, thanks for coming. And then a little farther down, you'll see our forum. And that's your opportunity to say, hey, I had this question about the different things that we were talking about in the program or in another part of the meeting, or you want to respond to something that somebody else has put in. Please feel free to do so. It's one of the ways that in an online asynchronous club, we can engage with each other. So we would certainly appreciate that. As we always do, we hand it back to our speaker for the final word. So, Stuart, I hand it back to you.
Well, thanks very much. And I just really to say thanks again once more for this opportunity. It's something new for me, and it's very neat and exciting to be able to do something new and to be able to talk to you, but really to address this fantastic organization, right? I've seen firsthand the difference that Rotary has made to people's lives, you know, and I think that, again, it's to go back to the kind of the message that I'm trying to get across, that we don't have to resign ourselves to a miserable future, right? That we know how to get there. We know what a better future looks like. And it's only through organizations such as Rotary, working in partnership with governments and stakeholders and companies all around the world, that we can get there, and that the future doesn't need to be bleak, right? Demography doesn't need to be destiny. We can have a better future.
Fantastic. Shags passes along the applause. We appreciate it. For all of you who have been watching, thank you again for joining us, and we will see you next week.